we're here to have a discussion about what reparations might look like in the United States. For those of you who are familiar or may not be familiar, Afro-Socialists and Socialists of Color within the DSA put out a statement in support of global reparations and have been leading discussions both at the convention nationwide, at the Left Forum here in New York City, and I think a couple other places, having reading groups, studying to see like what this might or could look like. And we also have our comrades in LA who have just been, I believe, started production on a film called 16,000, which I guess I'll have them speak to later, about what reparations might look like here in the United States. And so I thought, we thought this would be a good opportunity for us to have this discussion as we start to talk about these things and as a caucus and also carry the message nationwide. So without further ado, we have Bill Fletcher Jr.
Thank you, Bianca. How much time do I have?
You have, I assumed we were going to be for 2 hours. So however you want to break that up.
I can talk for 2 hours?
You can talk for a while.
Okay. I'm not going to talk for 2 hours, so everyone calm down. I want to lay out some thoughts and then open it up for some discussion. So I want to start with very basic understanding about what is reparations. Now, I'm not talking about reparations in terms of African Americans. What is reparations? And it's a term referring to repair, repairing the damage, repairing damage, compensating, a term that really started to arise in the 1800s in some very questionable circumstances. The French, for example, after having been defeated by the Haitians in 1803, came back to Haiti in the 1820s and demanded reparations from the Haitians. Why? Because the slaves were liberated. So the term can be used in a number of different ways. After World War I, of course, the defeated powers, particularly Germany, were supposed to pay reparations. And this became a major source of controversy and a major economic problem for Germany. After World War II, Germany paid reparations to Jews in the form of compensation to Israel, which has been a certain controversy. In the African American context, the issue of reparations, you can really argue, starts to arise in the 1800s, 1830s, 40s, during the period of what was seen as a moment when African slaves and freed Africans in many parts of the United States were demanding a return to Africa. And that was not a universal demand, but it was a demand. And in some sense, the demand to return was seen as a form of reparations. The most important, probably, moment was after the Civil War in Reconstruction, or actually beginning during the Civil War and then following the Civil War, with the whole idea of 40 acres and a mule. The idea that there needed to be compensation for the former slaves in order for them to achieve a living standard that had been denied them. And we all know that the 40 acres and a mule never happened, but there was, at a certain point during Reconstruction, a considerable redivision of wealth and division of land, although not nearly enough. The issue of reparations in one form or another continues into the 20th century. And I just want to just use one example where after World War II, there were movements among African Americans that were raising the issue of genocide. And there was a very famous We Charge Genocide document that the Civil Rights Congress issued went to the United Nations and was seeking international support and was trying to identify the situation facing African Americans and the kind of response that was needed around the world. So there was this intermixing of the demand for reparations, the demand for various forms of compensation, the denunciation of genocide, the demand for equality, et cetera. Beginning again in the 1960s, the idea of reparations in one form or another reemerges in the Black freedom movement, and particularly in the Black power side of the Black freedom movement, although there is a very famous quote from Martin Luther King, which raises the question. He doesn't use the term reparations, but he basically raises the concept of reparations. Now, one of the things to keep in mind, and this is really critical, is that there is a certain understanding of reparations when it comes, let's just focus on African Americans, but there's not agreement on what reparations would look like. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, so people shouldn't freak out about it. There are different ideas about what form reparations would be. So you have those that analogize reparations for African Americans with that which was paid to the Japanese who were put in concentration camps in 1942 in the United States. And people have said, well, we should calculate a number, and then that is the amount that should go to people of African descent. There were organizations like in Cobra. There was the work of Randall Robinson, the founder of Trans-Africa Forum, the work of Ron Daniels, that have raised this issue of reparations, but in different ways. People have conceived of it as anything ranging from handing out checks to one form or another of like a Marshall Plan, a domestic Marshall Plan, a major investment in resources to break down the barriers that remain of racist oppression and to create some sort of system of compensation. So when DSA and others enter into the debate about reparations, you don't have to enter in with the idea that it has to be one way or the other. That is something that will have to be negotiated over time. The issue is more whether it is a legitimate discussion to have about reparations, and second, who should it cover? And I'll get to that in a second. And so if we think about reparations as a form of repair, repairing the damage from hundreds of years of slavery, from Jim Crow segregation, and from de facto segregation, then we can start to think about what are the types of structural demands that we on the left should be advancing in conjunction with masses of Black folks. And how should the broader left support the demands for reparations from masses of Black folks? The debate around reparations allows for the exploration of the racial construction of US capitalism. And I think this is one of the most important aspects of what's going on right now, that to raise the issue of reparations is in fact to raise the issue of how do we understand US history. And I was, there was a story that my wife was reading this morning in the Washington Post about these various white folks that have gone to plantations, you know, Monticello and others, and become deeply upset when the tour guides start talking about slaves and slavery. And they get upset. Their attitude literally is, why do we have to keep hearing about slaves and slavery? As if you can divorce the development of these plantations, the development of US capitalism, cotton, tobacco, et cetera, from the labor force that was brought here as indentured servants and as slaves, and ultimately as racial slaves for life, as if you could divorce these. So the demand around reparations and the issue of reparations really provides for us on the left an opportunity to talk about the racial construction of capitalism. The other, another piece about the discussion of reparations that I think I have not seen enough is that it also starts to enter into the discussions of other forms of racist oppression that have permeated the United States. I mean, for example, the annexation of northern Mexico by the United States in 1848 and what subsequently happened to the people that came to be known as Chicanos and the issue of land and water rights, et cetera, et cetera. What happens to them? Well, how do they factor in the issue of the expulsion of quite possibly 2 million Mexicans and Chicanos from the United States in the 1930s? These all can lend themselves to discussions of how does a system repair that damage. I'm not saying that they would all be covered by reparations for Black people. My point is, however, that by raising the racist construction of the United States, we start to look at the United States not as some sort of abstract capitalist social formation onto which is appended race, but you start to see the way race is central from its inception. And you could give other examples. Now, one of the things that's come up at different points is this very complicated and controversial issue about who should be included when one is talking about reparations. And the answer to that question depends to some extent on how you envision reparations taking place. The other part of it has to do with how do you see people of African descent? And a third issue is, at what point does the clock stop running? In other words, like in legal theory, there's this notion of a continuing violation. I'll give you an example. That you have a company that was engaged in discrimination in, let's say, the year 2000, and you file a lawsuit against them, and the company has in fact not done anything to correct that violation in the period since 2000. So the courts can argue, or the plaintiffs can argue, that there's a continuing violation, that it's not like the clock stops at a certain point because the company has continued this particular practice, as opposed to a situation where one could say that something existed between 2000 and 2002. What I would argue is that we're dealing with a situation of a continuing violation, and that while there is reparations that one can argue in a very narrow sense for the slave period, I would say that particularly for those of us on the left, that's much too narrow, because while there was slavery for hundreds of years, we then have a small breather, you could say, during Reconstruction, and then white supremacy was back at it with Jim Crow segregation, the counter-revolution, and leading up to the situation we live in now where you have a de facto segregation. So there's an issue of a continuing violation. And within that context, who is affected? Well, the reality is that it's not simply people who are the direct descendants of folks that were brought to North American shores as slaves or as forced labor, and maybe they were indentured servants in the beginning, but overall ended up under the whip of racial slavery. But you see as a continuing violation the introduction of other populations. Cape Verdeans, who came over, they were the first post-1492 African population to come to the United States voluntarily. And they came free. They came oppressed, but they came free. Well, they come here and then they meld together to a great extent with other US African Americans. And while Cape Verdeans have an independent identity, they're also part of Black America. Or another example, after the Spanish-American War and in the early 1900s, you start to see the migration to the mainland of people of African descent from the Caribbean. You know, many examples of that. Malcolm X's mother, Louis Farrakhan. I mean, the list goes on. And the Caribbean people of African descent who were originally slaves come into the United States and they meld with US African Americans and they start to reshape what it means to be Black Americans. And this can go on. And it's not like at a certain point we could say that people that came here of African descent were free and clear of racist oppression and white supremacy. We can't say that, for example, once the Nigerians arrived, everything was hunky-dory, because the reality is that as people of African descent in the United States, that's what we're talking about, they become subject to the construction of white supremacist national oppression. So then, if you look at it that way, I would suggest, first of all, that the issue of reparations is not mainly about the handing out of checks. It's not mainly about calculating things. It's not mainly a DNA test. I mean, you know, like for example, and not to be absurd about it, someone like me who is of quite obviously of mixed blood, was raised African American with an African American identity, but I have all kinds of other things. Am I like, if checks being handed out, is that like, do I get partial payment? You know, is it like, does it depend on my the gene pool? I mean, there's a level of absurdity that comes about, and I would argue it is being articulated by right-wing nationalists within Black America in a way that is most divisive within Black America and divisive between Black America and other populations, and we should be very, very wary of them. So my inclination on this issue of reparations has been for most of the time that I've been involved in the issue, is to look at it as a structural demand, a demand on the state, a demand that the state compensates people of African descent en masse, as opposed to individually, and that this take the form of dramatic changes and reforms to be introduced. The opposition that I hear within progressive and left circles to reparations is frequently the kind of opposition that you hear that's raised anytime someone articulates the need for a demand specific to fighting racist and national oppression. For example, it's divisive. Or second, white folks are never going to go for it. Or a third, that what we need to do is find demands that are not specifically racial, but that actually, in effect, address the history and legacy of racist oppression. And the problem with all of those is summarized by something that Mao Zedong used to always say: if you don't hit it, it won't fall. That when you try to dance around race and racism, you end up inevitably not tackling it. You can think that you are, but you're not. You know, which is not to say that there's anything wrong with broad structural demands that may not be specific to fighting racist oppression. For example, around healthcare, or end to wars, or any number of things that are all completely legitimate demands. But even there, what we have to look at is the racial implications. Let me just give you an example from the realm of history. The GI Bill. You know, you may wonder, what does this have to do with reparations? Let me explain. So the GI Bill, passed during World War II, has been, by most studies, one of the most significant factors in raising the living standard of those who benefited by it and from it. Well, who were those people that benefited? Well, it turns out that it was mainly white veterans of World War II. And one of the things about the GI Bill is that and my father, who was not white, was one of those African Americans who did benefit from it. And in hearing his story, it was very evident how he benefited from it. He returned from the war. He went to college. He had been a high school dropout, finished high school, went to college, actually started graduate school. This put him in a completely different category than many other people who were not able to do that. Many African Americans, particularly in the South, were denied access to the GI Bill depending on how they were cashiered out of the military, but also in the South, Black veterans were frequently only permitted to go to Black schools. And when it came to mortgages, denied mortgages, whereas white veterans were able to benefit. Now, the GI Bill was technically race neutral, if you look at it. But the reality is that the way that it was actually implemented and the regulatory language that accompanied it made it put a racial tripwire there when it came to African Americans. So even when you have a demand that is allegedly racially neutral, we on the left have to always be identifying to what extent is this this demand, this legislation, whatever, meeting the needs of historically marginalized populations, and particularly those who have been racially oppressed. So we have to do that in either case. But on top of that, we should be identifying the particular ways of remedying the effects of historic racist oppression. And that really is what the reparations demand comes down to. A number of years ago, I had a debate that was supposed to be published with Adolph Reed. And he and I were on very friendly terms. And unfortunately, the book never got published. But we went back and forth about it because Adolph opposes the demand for reparations. And what I concluded is, as much as I agree with Adolph on many, many things, I thought that fundamentally his disagreement around reparations came from a failure to appreciate the centrality of race in the construction of capitalism and the necessity in building an anti-capitalist movement to specifically identify race and to identify race as part of the prop that holds capitalism together. And that there is no way that you can trick white people into unity. You can't advocate, whatever these race neutral structural demands and think that white folks are going to go for it, when in the back of our minds, we're still thinking we've got to somehow deal with the racist construction of the United States. So the issue of reparations is one piece of that, but it's only one piece. I guess the last thing I want to add to this is that there are those that have raised this in the demands to presidential candidates. And Bernie Sanders, when he was first asked about reparations some months back, I thought gave a terrible response. And it was very, very unfortunate. But there's two things I want to say about that. One is, as I've been saying, that Sanders needs a good racial advisor. The second thing is that the collection of forces right now are not such that reparations will be the major political issue in the presidential race. It may, however, be something that Trump uses. And we need to be ready for that, which means that we're going to need to be ready to have those discussions about race and about reparations as a demand to repair the damage. And we have to make sure we do not run away from that. When Trump and his allies start race baiting whoever ends up being the Democratic candidate and red baiting, as he's already doing, and talking about how the left is in left field and et cetera, and that it's talking about crazy ideas like reparations, we on the left have to be prepared to step forward and talk about why this is not crazy. And we need to talk about the history of the United States. And that, I would argue, is one of the most important things about this debate, that it lends itself to that discussion of the history of the United States and about what is to be done. So I'm going to stop there, and Bianca, however you want to handle questions and comments.
Sure. So I wonder if people have questions or comments, they could indicate, just say your name in the chat, and then I can call on you to ask your question or make your comment. So just put it in the chat. While we're waiting, I want to get my own in.
Go for it.
Sure. So while we're waiting for people to respond, I wonder, one of the things that struck me this year, and I know that resolutions in particular, like union conventions, aren't like that. Like they don't necessarily, sometimes they're just performative and they don't end up being anything. But I thought it was interesting that the NEA passed a resolution to support reparations. And I hear it come up a lot in my work with rank and file union members about how they should be talking about it. Does labor have a role to play in it, et cetera? And so I wonder if you had thoughts on that.
Yeah, I do. Thank you for raising that. Labor not only has a role to play in it, but it can only succeed insofar as we do have racial justice education within labor. So, in other words, what I worry about is what some people call resolutionary socialism, right? Where the main thing we're doing is passing resolutions that have very little backing and very little understanding, or where delegates may pass something just because they say, we just, okay, fine. What we have to insist upon are real, honest to goodness discussions about history. It's really important that white Americans, specifically white workers, understand what happened under slavery and the role of slavery in the construction of US capitalism. People need to get that, and not looking at it as simply a moral issue, which obviously it is, but looking at it in terms of the economics of the development of capitalism. And what does one say? When you have this entire population that is brought here, that constructs this social system, and then is essentially told, get the hell out of here. We need to have those discussions. We need to have discussions about what I'm calling the continuing violation. One of the things that is so important to look at is the way that government actively collaborated with the private sector in segregation, particularly housing segregation. And I'm thinking after World War II, most especially, that these various reforms that were won, the suburbanization of the United States, et cetera, which was all supposed to be race neutral, at least in the North, ended up being to the detriment of people of African descent. That discussion needs to happen in the ranks of the unions. So I think it's great that the resolutions happen. I'm hoping that in every case there's good debate and discussions, but I think that what's more important is to ensure that in every one of our local unions, that we have honest to goodness racial justice education that is rooted in history and is not rooted in diversity trainings.
Thank you for that. Okay, so I see that Shane, you had a question, so go ahead, ask your question.
Hey, can y'all hear me?
Yes.
Sweet. Well, I guess my question was specifically on this narrower or specific question about cash payments.
Mhm.
That's kind of the way it was posed most recently to Bernie in the debates, was specifically about cash payments for descendants of slaves. And I was wondering what you think about cash payments. Is that outside of like what you advocate for, Bill, in terms of reparations? And how would you suggest that people respond to that, or are you actually supportive of that? And then second question real quick, sorry, I'm gonna sneak one in, is how do you think reparations are very popular in the Black community, but the polling is almost like exactly the opposite, both in the Latino and white communities. And so I'm wondering how you think what's the most persuasive way, or how have you persuaded people, if you have in the past, that are white or Latino to support reparations?
Those are great questions. So let me start with the cash payments. That's not what I'm inclined towards. It's not what I advocate. I think that ultimately there will have to be a decision that's driven largely by African Americans about what that looks like. But I think that cash payments will be very hard to play out for the reasons that I identified earlier. I'll come back to that in a second. Let me say what you mentioned the issue of Sanders. I think that a politician, when asked the question about cash payments, should give a twofold answer. For someone like Sanders, I would assume that Sanders supports structural reforms. And I think he should say that. I think he should also say that ultimately this will be a question that Black America will have to decide. And I think that we leave it at that. It's premature and not very helpful to get into a whole debate about what form it takes right now, when what we're really doing is trying to build a movement that raises the question. So that's not my inclination. In terms of the issue you're raising about the persuasive arguments, I don't know that I've ever persuaded anyone, to tell you the truth. I don't know. What I can say is that I see the eyes of people light up when I talk through history of the United States. And that's what I think we need to be concentrating on. That you historically contextualize the demand for reparations in much the same way that Japanese had to contextualize the atrocity that was their imprisonment in those concentration camps during World War II. So, because otherwise it becomes very moralistic, and there's a real danger there. I'm not surprised that white people would not be particularly sympathetic to the demand for reparations, since most white people think that the issue of race has been settled. Or to borrow from something I saw from a conservative recently, that the reparations took the form of the Civil War, and that the Civil War and the shedding of blood to end slavery was the reparations, which I think is sophistry. So I would say that historical analysis, that's what we've got to really pound away.
Cool. Thank you. Carl, can you hear us?
He might be on mute.
Carl,
Let me
can you hear?
unmute.
Okay, yeah.
I can
Go
hear
ahead
you.
and Good. Go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, Bill. I'm interested in how you think the discussion around reparations could move us towards some democratic process for how Black people can make an independent decision separate from all these other entities. For example, something like Black people's assemblies or plebiscites, some movement towards self-government. How could Black people make a majority decision? And I'm thinking the process of that discussion around reparations might even be more important than what the outcomes are, because it could take a lot of different forms. But how do we make a decision? Or how could we make a decision? What possibilities are there?
Well, you're asking a tough question, bro. And I would begin with this. I don't know that we will get reparations short of socialism. And let me explain my thinking. It's not just that slavery was central to the development of capitalism in the United States and Western Hemisphere. Our existence is central. We are at the core of the other. And capitalism needs that other in order to scare the bejeebies out of white workers. And to have the apparition, the Black apparition, hanging over them and creating the fear of the uprising. And so it's not clear to me that under capitalism, democratic or otherwise, that we will get the opportunity for reparations, even with a major mass movement. Now, I don't say that to be defeatist, don't get me wrong. What I'm saying is that our future as Black people is directly tied in with whether capitalism continues or whether we go down the socialist road. Although there are certain areas of concentration for people of African descent in the country, we're not an island. We're not like Puerto Rico that could in fact declare independence, or Micronesia. We are in a very different situation, and white capitalism is loath to let us go, because in our absence, there goes the bogeyman. So that's a preface to your question. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be fighting for reparations, because the fight for reparations is part of our fight for liberation, which in fact is a fight against white supremacist capitalism. And that's the fight that we have to conduct. So very specifically to your question, I would say you're right on time with the idea of assemblies. I think, for example, that Black leftists and our allies need to be taking greater advantage of the UN decade of the people of African descent, for discussions in Black communities, certainly in the hemisphere, but in the United States. Discussions in religious centers, discussions in educational centers, discussions in mass organizations about our future, posing the question of which road forward. And what does it mean in terms of, demands for autonomy, demands for independence, demands for reparations. I think there is no one particular road. What the road for me is a road of broad discussion, broad debate about our future and what does it mean in the 21st century. So I think that there's a number of things that we can be doing, and that we on the left, whether you're in DSA or whether you're in some other group, can play a very important role in trying to advance those discussions. That's what I would say we need to be doing right now. Now, down the road, where might this lead? Well, it might lead back to the United Nations. It might lead to the road that William Patterson and others took when they went to the United Nations and cried genocide. It might lead to a demand that there is some sort of plebiscite. But the thing that we have to understand is that, as we can see in the whole question of Palestine and the United Nations, it's not just whether an issue is morally just. It's not even just if that an issue has broad support around the world. There have to be movements around the world around these issues, and I would argue in solidarity with people of African descent in the United States who are demanding reparations. In that sense, this is a global issue.
Okay, we've got a couple more. Do you want to take a couple at a time? Or do you want
because these are really good questions, and I don't want to blow anybody off.
Okay, that's fair. Go ahead, Ashley.
Hi, my name is Ashley. Thank you so much, Bill, for being on this call. One of the things that I've been really frustrated about, just in general with reparations conversations in AfroSoc and outside and just more broadly, is that these conversations seem to conflate the sort of time periods that we should be getting historical redress for. Because me as a Black American, like, no white people in our family that I can like identify, not very many immigrants from Africa or Caribbean in my family, like, I want a check that goes back to 1619 with interest. That's like a real wealth redistribution demand that I want as a Black person. But at the same time, for current and future, I always think of those two separately. And I think of like socialism plus affirmative action is the future and like current structural demand. And so it frustrates me that people try to conflate these two and like leave off the historical part and only talk about current structural demands and future things. And I think both of those things need to be talked about, but people need to be really clear. And so I was wondering what you think about sort of how people are talking about it and sort of conflating those two things, because I get really frustrated, even like with AOC talking about, oh, we need to expand reparations. I felt like that was a massive derail and sort of, you know, I think sort of like watering down how Black people get affected. And then I hear about, oh, well, shouldn't we get white people to get reparations because, you know, they're working class and they be exploited by capitalism. And I get really, really frustrated that this conversation keeps expanding to include other groups when this is an original demand that Black people have made. The word reparations is particular to Black people because it's particular to what we've endured in this country. And so I was just curious what you think about how that conversation goes. Thank you so much.
So the one part, let me start with a difference. Reparations is not particular to Black folks. When you look at, and I'm talking about even in progressive setting, the Japanese Americans were demanding reparations from pretty much the moment that they got out of concentration camps. So in that sense, we've got to understand reparations is the justifiable demand of people who have been the victims of very specific type of oppression, colonialism, slavery, in particular, and national oppression. And so the demand on the part of the Japanese for reparations was a just demand and a demand that we should have supported. I think that the broader issue that you're raising, which I think where I agree with you, is that there are those that want to water it down, as you described, to basically say, well, essentially anybody that was the victim of capitalism should get reparations. And no, anyone who was the victim of capitalism should get socialism. The issue of reparations is, again, historically specific. Now, the problem, that I was raising before about the issue of a check comes down in part to who is entitled to it. And how do you identify that? Does someone have to be a so-called pure of African descent? Well, if that's the case, I don't know many people of African descent in the United States that are pure. People have Native American, they have all kinds of stuff in them. Are we talking only about people that were the descendants of slaves in North America? And okay, so what if you have a family like mine that has Caribbean as well as people who are the descendants of folks that were slaves in the South? Does that mean like part of my family gets it and another part doesn't? See, that's where it gets really dicey. And that's why I think that we're talking about, particularly given the span of time we're talking about, which one could argue goes back even before 1619. I mean, there's a interesting story that Sir Francis Drake in the 1500s actually may have been the first person to bring African slaves, former slaves, from Colombia to North America, to what was then the Roanoke colony. But at least if you want to say, going back to 1619, it's sort of like, well, what's the criteria? And I think that's where we have to be careful. I am one that definitely is in favor of major structural demands that speak to the legacy of slavery and post-slavery racist oppression. The post-slavery slavery by another name, as an important book is entitled. I think that that's what we've got to look at. That's why I keep talking about that there's a continuing violation, and that Black America should be the recipient of compensation to repair the damage for that continuing violation. Now, we may disagree on this, and I would say that reasonable people can disagree. We don't have to agree on whether it's a check or something else. It's premature. What we do need to agree on, though, is the legitimacy of the demand and what it means to put that demand before white capital.
So, Steve, you're next.
Hi there. So I kind of wanted to ask you a little bit about the international dimension of this. And knowing full well that there's a right wing and a left wing way to frame this question. But my question is, okay, so we mostly talked about, Black people in the United States who were the descendants of slaves in the context of reparations. And I wanted to ask that, given that whether it's in kind or a financial form, reparations would, or what would be the basis of reparations would come from value chains that reflect the ongoing legacy of the US empire in Africa, elsewhere around the world, since the Cold War, before the Cold War. And like, how do we square the circle? Like, how do we showcase that this is a legitimate demand while also knowing that that ongoing legacy of U.S. empire, which going all the way back to when the U.S. was part of Britain, that exists.
You start by having people read How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. really, that what you're arguing is incredibly important in terms of looking at the legacy of European colonialism and U.S. Imperialism, and that in fact one of the issues in Europe, which right-wing populists are taking advantage of, is the extent to which much of Europe wishes to deny the legacy of colonialism and deny the implications of colonialism in the sense of people coming to the metropoles, migrating to Europe after Europe raped Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And so there's both the historical piece of this in terms of colonialism going back to the 1400s, 1500s. And then there's the more contemporary issues. For example, when I was running Trans-Africa Forum back in the early 2000s, one of the issues that I was trying to gain some traction on was the need for reparations for Angola and for the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And that when you actually look at what's happened in those countries, but let me just focus on the DRC, and you look at the 10 million killed in the 1800s under Leopold, when you look at the rape of the DRC for its materials, et cetera, the issue is not simply stopping the atrocities, as important as that is, but it is also about how do we compensate the DRC? What is the obligation on the part of Europe and the United States for the rebuilding of the DRC? That's reparations. And it is every bit as legitimate as the demand for reparations in the United States. And one can go on and on, and it's not just about Africa. One of the things that, I grew up during the Vietnam War, and I looked at what the United States did to Vietnam. 2 million Vietnamese killed. The legacy of Agent Orange, which is still with us. The number of Vietnamese killed every year who stumble across bombs that have not been detonated. Is there some sort of compensation due to the Vietnamese? And I would say yes. I mean, this is part of the internationalism that we should be advocating. When you are in the heart of an empire, it's not like you can just simply say, we're going to be nice the next time. It's that this country played a major role in destroying much of the planet. And we've got to do something about it. So our internationalist duty is to demand reparations, or reparations for Haiti. Haiti that was blackmailed by the French from the 1820s to 1947. Blackmailed so that the French would not invade them. As Aristide said shortly before he was overthrown in 2004, the French owe us. So this is part of the discussion, the internationalist discussion. Now, one of the big challenges, as you probably know, is that we live in a country where the slogan under the dollar bill should really be "from now on," which is the idea that we may have raped your family and destroyed your land, but from now on, we commit to being cool. And we're not going to talk about the past. And that's part of the problem that we're up against. And it even permeates the left, where people feel like, well, that's the past. Let's not really focus in on that. We've got to focus on what will unite us. And that if we talk too much about the past, it's going to be divisive. No. You've got to talk about the past. you've got to talk about what happened in the DRC as much as you're talking about what happened to people that were brought over here as forced labor and as slaves. So it is part of our internationalist duty.
I've got two more questions on the stack. One of them is from Sean from Harlem. Can you hear me?
Hey, what's up? I can hear you.
Cool. Go ahead.
All right. Can everybody hear me? Is this okay?
Yep.
Go for it.
All right. So I have a little bit of a loaded question, comment kind of thing. I've been like literally writing and rewriting it this whole time because I'm not sure how exactly I want to say it. So I hope that the words that come out of my mouth are somewhat articulate.
Mm-hmm.
But I was just thinking as a general comment that achieving anything like reparations would be impossible without restructuring the system. So I agree with Bill entirely. There's no way we can get anything like a lasting state of reparations unless we change how we do things from the bottom up. And I keep hearing, we keep returning to how do we, fix, or how do we issue reparations for what was done to the African American people, And as a Black man living in Harlem, I feel like even today we are still living, the effects of what was done to us, the effects of colonization. And my question is, how exactly do we need to have the discussion for reparations now or later? And when we do, will it involve efforts for decolonization? Because I feel like we are very close to that. I feel like the two are almost intertwined, because to me, when I hear people say, oh yeah, we need to issue checks and we need to, pay people back, I agree with that, but all at the same time, even when you do, pay people back, you give them financial compensation, the system's just going to take all that and spit the people back out, assuming it doesn't kind of pick them up and turn them into petty bourgeoisie or a bourgeoisie themselves. And then, the cycle of abuse will start all over again, and the oppression will just kind of move on to a different people in America and internationally, really.
Mm-hmm.
So how exactly do we avoid that kind of conundrum when we address the conversation around reparations?
I love these questions. This is, well, let me just start with this. The demand for reparations is a demand we need to be raising now. It's legitimate. And there are different kinds of demands. There are propaganda demands, there's agitational demands, and there's action demands. Propaganda demands are those demands which are longer term. They're not immediately actionable. Agitational are when the demands that right now can start to inspire a movement, and actionable where we can see in the imminent future the ability to exercise them. And the demand for reparations has gone through, this is not linear. The demand for reparations has gone through each of those stages, and having gone through a stage doesn't mean you can't go back into that stage. It depends on the nature of the mass movements and people's political consciousness. So I would say that the demand is now, and that it is important as part of our larger demand against racist and national oppression. And that even when you cannot win, that should not stop the raising of those demands. Because there are demands that capitalism simply cannot grant, but are demands on the minds of people, and they summarize the aspirations of the population. And that's part of our job, from the masses to the masses, listening to people, interpreting it, providing it back in ways that provide strategic direction. So that is a great deal of what we need to be doing. But there's something else that you're hitting on that I think is very important, which is that even if I'm not closing off the possibility that we can win reparations under capitalism. I'm saying that I think it might be unlikely. But here's the caveat, that our opponents frequently, and I think this may have been what you're getting at, reshape our demands in ways to answer them such that the system is further legitimized. But the demands we raised are neutered. And I'll give you an example from the late 60s, the demand for Black power. So the demand for Black power, when it was first raised, was not raised as a reformist demand. It was really talking about Black political and economic power. It was talking about self-determination. In 1968-69, Richard Nixon did something quite remarkable. He started talking about Black capitalism. And he essentially articulated an equation. Black power equals Black capitalism equals Black power. And a lot of folks went for the okie-doke. And not just like reactionary Black folks. I mean, you know, people that had been liberal, in some cases seemingly radical. They went for the idea, they accepted the reinterpretation of Black power as being Black capitalism and said, let's go for that. So that our opponents re-articulated our demands. This always happens. This is always a danger in any reform struggle that we engage in, which is one of the reasons that you need a solid left that is constantly beating back the efforts of our opponents to re-articulate our demands in ways that demobilize the people and confuse the people. So reparations could absolutely be re-articulated in a way that is not very helpful. And we see some of that already. So you see these right-wing nationalists that say the only people that should be able to receive reparations, and by reparations, they're talking about a check, are people who are the descendants of slaves. And the rest, forget it, right? And that immediately creates a major division within the social formation called Black America. Reparations could be the demand around affirmative action. Initially was re-articulated, without using the term, as affirmative action. Now, the interesting thing about affirmative action is that one could argue that affirmative action as a program should have been open only for people who had been the victims of racist and national oppression, as opposed to just people who migrated here. It became re-articulated over time in a way to water the whole thing down. Again, we on the left have to be the ones that are challenging that. And so there could be people that articulate reparations in other ways that are not very helpful. Not simply that only people that are the descendants of slaves that were brought to North America can be eligible, but it could be setting a cap on the amount of money. Or it might be that another version of Richard Nixon's Black capitalism. I could absolutely see that. That reparations will take the form of building Black businesses. And if Trump was smart, that's exactly what he would do. He would reach out to right-wing nationalists in Black America and say, you know what? You guys that are talking reparations, there's a point to what you're raising. And so what we need to do is we need to support Black business. We need to pull away from this public sector stuff. And we need to be really infusing the spirit of private enterprise and we will provide special loans and other guarantees. I could absolutely see that as all of a sudden being re-articulated by some of our own leaders as reparations. So that is a danger, and I appreciate you raising this. And I just want to highlight that as something that we on the left have to always be aware of.
Did we lose you?
No,
Oh, okay, sorry.
no, I was waiting for either a round of applause or some more questions. You know.
I thought you were talking. Okay, so we only have one more question that I can see, and they've given you applause. Andrew from Chicago.
Yes. Yeah, Andrew from Chicago. So the question that I want to bring up is around a lot of the discussions of reparations, and granted it is fluid and it's meant to be debated, but do seem to focus a lot on just sort of like specific resources, and often I think what would exist in like jobs and education. But I think the potential fear is that like once you dump a ton of resources, then you have to deal with an issue of gender and how that sort of interacts with resources. And I was wondering if you had sort of like any specific way that you wanted to think about how to avoid sort of a pitfall where you give resources or the sort of promise, the reparation was made, but then what it sort of blossomed into was just like a growth of patriarchy, because if we do focus so much on like specifically money, as often that goes towards men in the society. So I was wondering how you could sort of like envision a reparations that did lift up Black America, but also did make sure that it didn't amplify what would be existing relationships of gender within the community itself.
I don't think that it's necessarily going to play out that way when I look at the growth of Black female businesses. And this is why I say that we have to be very careful about the way that reparations is interpreted. Because if it gets interpreted as we're going to build Black business, this is not just going to be a male thing. And there will be many people, including friends of ours, that are going to say, well, it may not be exactly what we want, but this is a hell of a lot better than what we've had. See, I think going back to or linking this with an earlier question, there will need to be some sort of institution, and this is where it gets really rough, that negotiates for this to happen, whether it's under capitalism or under socialism. That institution has not yet been created or identified. We cannot afford to have a situation where we simply raise a demand and then the White House or Congress grants it, says, okay, you got it. And now what we're going to do, what we in Congress are going to do, or what the White House is going to do, is we're going to create this special commission that's going to figure out how to divide this stuff up. See, that would be, we would be cruising for a bruising if that happened. And I could absolutely imagine that. It's one of the reasons we on the left need to be thinking one step further, right? We need to be thinking about raising this demand, but then start thinking about, okay, so how could this get played out? And if the other side comes back with some BS, what is our counter proposal around this? And so I think we need to start thinking about this issue of institutional construction. It's almost like a government in exile would be a bit overly dramatic, but it may be some institution that gains legitimacy, like a united front within Black America, that is truly broad and representative. that would oversee how the demand was implemented. And I don't think it's too early. This was actually part of the debate that Adolf and I had. I don't think it's too early to start looking at that, about how that might play out. Because I could absolutely imagine us being caught with our pants down by the other side, particularly if, as was raised, the demand for reparations ends up intersecting with broader demands against racist and national oppression. Let me just add one other thing, which is unrelated to your question, Andrew. It has to do with one of my worries. One of the things that we've seen happen over the last 20 years or so among many Native American tribes is this very destructive focus on who's really Native American. And the Cherokees have been one of the tribes that's really been at the fore on this, leading to the expulsion of people of African descent who grew up Cherokee. Now, one of the things about Native Americans that I always found quite interesting was that being a part of a particular tribe was not mainly about bloodline. One of the most famous military leaders of the Shawnee was a white guy named Blue Jacket, who had been kidnapped, I think, when he was a kid and raised as a Shawnee, and was slightly older than Tecumseh. The Africans running away from slavery were generally welcomed into tribes. And there were some tribes that unfortunately practiced slavery, but most tribes didn't, and they welcomed in people of African descent. And whether it was in the helping of the construction of what it meant to be Seminole, or whether people were becoming Choctaw or Iroquois or whatever, people of African descent and people of European descent were absorbed. They were absorbed into those tribes. In the last 20 or so years, there's been this fixation on what does it mean to be Native American. And it's led to the expulsion of people who could not demonstrate a particular kind of bloodline. But what they could demonstrate is that for 100 years or so, their families had been Cherokee. They understood themselves to be Cherokee. They grew up around Cherokees. And now all of a sudden someone was saying, oh, no, you're not Cherokee, you're Black. This is what I fear if we on the left don't lead the reparations discussion. The Black left doesn't lead the reparations discussion. That we could find ourselves in a situation where we're doing DNA tests to determine who is really of African descent. And do you have enough African blood? And can you actually demonstrate that your family didn't come here from Jamaica, but actually came here in 1656, directly from what's now Senegal or Angola? See, it gets really complicated. And this is why we on the Black left have to be very careful, and we have to be really taking an internationalist approach to this, a redistributionist approach to this, and an approach that really aims to repair the damage. I'll leave it at that.
Okay. I wanted to open up the floor because I realized that some people are calling in and so they can't put it in the chat if they want to ask a question. So if anybody's calling in on the phone and wants to ask a question, now would be the time to do so. Just unmute yourself, I think. I don't think they can unmute themselves. Oh yeah, that's right. We can't unmute you. Okay, well, I'm sorry. I apologize to those of you who are on the phone and can't ask a question.
I have a suggestion.
Sure.
So for those that can't ask questions, why don't they send you some emails with questions and compile them? And then let me take a look at them and I'll see whether I can respond to them either in writing or do another webinar. Now, I'm not in a position to write a book, right? But there may be a number of questions that I can answer in writing for those that we're not able to answer them. So if they send you the questions.
That's perfect. I think people like that idea, or at least the people who are able to type. I do have one other, just one quick question,
Sure.
I guess. You know, so we'll have, you know, more calls as a caucus about how we want to approach this and trying to think about this. One of the things that folks are doing right now are putting together like reading groups around that are public to start to do the work that you're talking about, which is talking about history particularly. As I mentioned, the LA Comrades are doing a film. And so, and we'd like to, and there's been like some talks about having some sort of like town halls, you know, for instance, in Harlem and other places with some of our allies. I wonder if you feel like addressing it, like just talking about history is like the main way that we need to like approach this. And if you can think about other ways that are helpful, like for instance, some people, you know, see this as possibly a way to talk to Black people about socialism. I myself went to a talk, Charles Barron, the assembly person here, had a talk on a Friday night in East New York around reparations, and 60 people were out to hear about the, I can't remember, they're the something 14, but you referenced them, the ones that went to the United Nations.
December 12th.
Oh, December 12th, excuse me. Yeah, and talking about that movement, they showed a short like piece of the documentary. There were people there actually who had went and spoke about it. He was pushing for, you know, something that wasn't specific, saying don't get caught up in the, you know, in the specifics as you're saying, let's just get the commission. He's trying to get a commission for New York State specifically. But he already has in mind the people that, you know, he's already named the people that he wants to sit on the commission, which is, you know, whatever. I just wonder if, you know, there's a way that that you feel like we could talk about it besides historic, like to me, I think, you know, some people are really wanting to approach it like with a question of like democracy or the assemblies that folks mentioned earlier. What's going to be, we don't actually know this, but, you know, like, what are ways that you feel like it would be helpful for us to approach this as we take this message externally?
Before I answer that, someone made a comment. Rather than my writing responses, how about video responses to save Bill some labor? Absolutely, brilliant idea. And whoever wrote that is a friend of mine for life. See, Bianca, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to answer your question very well. I think that there is no silver bullet when it comes to reparations. There's no one answer. I keep emphasizing history in large part because that is what white America keeps running away from. And it's not even just with us. It's interesting, like when you deal with Holocaust denial, and how quickly Europe and much of the United States wanted to distance itself from and forget about the Holocaust and all of its ramifications. Now, I think one of the problems is that the Holocaust against the Jews ended up being taken in a way that separated it from other Holocausts that have happened around the planet, like the Holocaust I just mentioned about the 10 million Congolese murdered under King Leopold. But there's this tendency to try to get away from the legacy. And that has happened with us in steroids. The idea, I don't mean that we have, I mean when it comes to the Black, the African descendant in the United States, this country does everything it can to avoid the question of what is owed to us and what we did to create this country. And I feel like we have to keep reminding people of that. Now, is the demand around reparations linked to socialism? Absolutely. Because, I mean, as I said before, I don't think that a real addressing of the legacy of slavery and national oppression can happen outside of the elimination of capitalism. I don't think it can happen. I think that we can make some major steps forward, major demands, etc. But in terms of actually confronting this continuing violation, this violation will continue as long as capitalism exists. And that's part of what we on the Black left need to say in the reparations debate. So we should never poo-poo the demand for reparations. We should never say it's not enough. We should say we're absolutely there and supporting it, but we need more, right? And we need the reconstruction, the fundamental social transformation of this thing called the United States.
Well, thank you so much for that. The bunch of applause from the participants. We really appreciate you taking the time, as we're thinking this through as mostly young people, new socialists, new to the left, and trying to figure out, what we believe about it and what we have to say as a group and how we can work with other folks who are already on the, have been working on this for decades. So we really appreciate that.
My appreciation. I'm very honored that you asked me. Thank you very much.
Thank you.